Today I'm going to talk about ribs, sternum, and thoracic wall as a second lesson or lesson 2. And I expect you could in this lesson explain ribs, and I expect you could describe typical and atypical ribs, name the joints and their ligaments. Also, I expect you could explain first, second, 11th and 12th ribs specification. That is very important to us. And I expect you could explain and describe the sternum and its attachment. And finally, I expect you could name layers of thoracic wall and muscles. So let's get started with bones and joints of thorax. As I said before, the thorax is an osteocartilaginous cavity or cage for various viscera, providing them due support and protection. This cage is not static, but dynamic as it moves at its various joints, increasing or decreasing various diameters of the cavity for an extremely important process of respiration, which is life for all of us. Uh, the bones of this cage is one of the bone of this cage is ribs or costae. There are 12 ribs on each side forming the greater part of the thoracic skeleton. The number may be increased by development of a cervical or a lumbar ribs. The cervical and lumbar ribs are abnormal ribs in a thoracic cage. Or the number may be reduced to 11 by the absence of the 12 ribs. As I said before, the 11 and 12 ribs are smaller than other ribs. The absence of the 12 ribs caused to reduce the number of the ribs to 11. The ribs are bony arcs arranged one below the other. The gaps between the ribs are called intercostal spaces. The spaces are deeper in front than behind, as I said before, and deeper between the upper than between the lower ribs. The ribs are placed obliquely, the upper ribs being less obliquely than the lower. The obliquity reaches its maximum at the 9 ribs, and thereafter it's gradually decreased to the 12th rib. Another point about the ribs is the length of the ribs. The length of the ribs increase from the 1st to the 7th ribs and then gradually decrease from the 8th to 12th ribs. The breadth of the ribs decrease from above downwards. In the upper 10 ribs, the anterior ends are broader than the posterior ends. Another point about bones or ribs or costae of costal cage is the first 7 ribs, which are connected through layer cartilage to the sternum are called true ribs or vertebro-sternal ribs. The remaining 5 are false ribs. As I said before in a lesson 1, out of these, the cartilage of the 8th, 9th, and 10th ribs are joined to the next higher cartilage and are known as a vertebrocondylar ribs. The anterior ends of the 11th and 12th ribs are free and are called floating ribs or vertebral ribs. And the last point of the bones or ribs is the first two and last three ribs have special features and are atypical ribs. The third to ninth ribs are typical ribs. So we have two category of ribs: typical ribs and atypical ribs. Number 1, 2, 10 to 11 to 12 are atypical ribs, and ribs from 3rd to 9 are typical ribs. And as I said before, there are gaps or space between upper and lower ribs that called intercostal space. Let's talk about typical ribs. Typical ribs, in the next slide, typical ribs are from 3 to 9 ribs. Typical ribs, I'm going to tell you about two points that are important about typical ribs. For each ribs, we should define the side determination and the features of a typical or atypical ribs. So, in the side determination, I'm going to tell you the anterior end. Look at this picture. Here is a typical ribs. We have a posterior end and the anterior end that is attached to the costal cartilage, and through due to the costal cartilage, the sternum here. To the side determination, there are 2 points about side determination. The anterior end bears here. The anterior end bears a concave depression. The posterior end bears a head, neck, and tubercle. The shaft, here is a shaft or body of a ribs. The shaft is convex outwards, and there is costal groove here, and there is a costal groove situated along the lower part of its inner surface, so that the lower border is thin, and the upper border is round. So we have an anterior end here and the posterior end here. We have a body or shaft and costal groove in the lower part. So the inferior border is thin and the upper border or superior border is round. So let's talk about features of a typical rib. First of all, I'm going to tell you each rib has 2 ends, anterior and posterior. Its shaft comprises upper and lower borders and outer and inner surfaces. So we have a posterior end, anterior end, upper border, lower border, a lateral surface, and medial surface, or outer surface, inner surface. The anterior ends or anterior sternal end is oval and concave for articulation with its costal cartilage. The posterior end